Cold cash doesn't buy warm bodies. Claire had 50 million in liquid assets and a custom titanium wheelchair, but the top-tier fertility clinic still handed her glossy brochures full of anonymous, sterile donor profiles. She didn't want a stranger. She wanted compliance, predictability. When she called her head of fleet maintenance into the penthouse, offering a life-altering sum for a simple biological favor, his reaction cracked her pristine reality. "Why me?" Arthur laughed, a harsh, jagged sound. "I'm your mechanic." Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 64th floor, leaving distorted streaks across the city skyline. Claire Montgomery hated the rain. It made the joints in her lower back ache with a dull, throbbing heat, a phantom reminder of the crushed L4 vertebrae that had tethered her to a seated position for the last 11 years. She pressed the joystick of her chair, rolling backward from the glass. The motors whirred, a high-pitched, barely audible hum that served as the soundtrack to her entire existence. The penthouse smelled of ozone, filtered air, and the faint, acidic tang of cold espresso sitting on her marble desk. Spread across the cool stone surface were 3 manila folders, not corporate acquisitions, not quarterly earnings reports, medical histories, background checks, financial statements. Claire reached out, her manicured fingernail tapping the center folder. Arthur Pendleton, 34, 6'1". No history of genetic anomalies, heart disease, or early-onset cognitive decline. Blood type, O negative, perfect vision, perfect teeth. He had been working in her company's subterranean garage for 4 years, keeping the fleet of executive black cars running with quiet, invisible efficiency. More importantly, she knew his financial reality. She opened the file. A copy of a foreclosure notice from 2 months ago. A stack of past due statements from a pediatric dental surgeon. Arthur had a 6-year-old daughter. He was drowning in the slow, agonizing way that working-class people drowned, inches at a time, keeping his chin up just enough to gasp for air. Claire didn't feel pity. Pity was a useless emotion. Pity didn't build her logistics empire, and pity certainly hadn't helped her adapt after the accident. What she felt was a cold, absolute certainty. He was the perfect candidate. She wanted a child. The biological ticking clock was a cliché she loathed, but her doctors had been explicit. Her pelvic floor and nervous system were already compromised. If she intended to carry a pregnancy, the window was closing rapidly. The trauma to her spine made the prospect dangerous, but Claire lived her life entirely through calculated risks. The fertility clinics had offered her catalogues of Ivy League sperm donors, faceless men who played lacrosse and supposedly loved classical music. She found the concept repulsive. She needed to know the raw material. She needed to see it, verify its temperament, and most crucially, control it. An anonymous donor could harbor hidden flaws. A wealthy donor might contest custody. Arthur Pendleton was trapped by his love for his child and his lack of capital. He was fiercely protective, physically robust, and fundamentally desperate. He could be bought. And once bought, he could be silenced through an ironclad NDA. She pressed the intercom button on her desk. The plastic gave a satisfying little click. "Diane." "Yes, Miss Montgomery." Her assistant's voice was crisp, filtered through the speaker. "Send Arthur Pendleton up from the garage, now." "The mechanic?" "Ma'am, he's currently under the Maybach. Should I have him wash up first?" "No," Claire said, her eyes locked on his photo in the file, a candid shot taken by corporate security, showing a man with exhaustion etched into the corners of his eyes, wiping grease from his forehead. "Send him exactly as he is." She released the button. Her left leg spasmed, a sudden, violent kick against the footrest of her chair. She grabbed her thigh, fingers digging into the unfeeling muscle, pressing down hard until the spasm, subsided into a weak tremor. Her breathing grew shallow. She hated her body's mutinies. She hated the lack of control. This transaction would be different. This she would dictate from start to finish. The private elevator pinged softly. The heavy oak doors slid apart, and the sterile silence of Claire's office was immediately violated by the heavy, rubber-soled tread of Arthur's work boots. He stepped into the room, stopping just at the edge of the Persian rug, reluctant to dirty the antique wool. He smelled intensely of motor oil, burnt rubber, and cheap, generic laundry detergent. It was a sharp, aggressive scent that cut right through the expensive, climate-controlled nothingness of the penthouse. "Ms. Montgomery," Arthur said. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone, roughened by years of yelling over idling engines. He stood awkwardly, hands shoved into the front pockets of his dark blue coveralls. There was a smear of black grease across his left cheekbone. His knuckles were permanently stained, the skin calloused and split at the cuticles. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked tired. "Mr. Pendleton," Claire rolled forward, maneuvering her chair around the desk so there were no barriers between them. "Thank you for coming up on such short notice." Arthur's gaze flicked to her legs, strapped neatly to the footrests, then quickly back to her face. It was the standard reaction. People always looked at the chair first. "Is there a problem with the Maybach? I told the dispatcher the suspension was riding rough. We're waiting on a part from Stuttgart." "This isn't about the cars." He frowned. The creases on his forehead deepened. "Then what is it? Did I park in the wrong spot again?" Claire didn't smile. She laced her fingers together, resting them in her lap. "I've been reviewing your file, Arthur. You make $68,000 a year. You have a daughter, Lily, who recently required 3 root canals and a specialized spacer. Your insurance, my company's insurance, covered 30% of that." Arthur's posture changed instantly. The casual weariness vanished, replaced by a rigid, defensive tension. He pulled his hands out of his pockets. "What the hell is this? Are you firing me? Because if you're firing me, you don't need to read my bank statements to do it." "I am not firing you." "Then why are you digging into my kids' dental records?" His voice rose, vibrating with a protective anger that Claire immediately categorized as a positive genetic trait. Loyalty. Aggression when threatened. "Good. I need something from you," Claire stated, her voice flat, devoid of any inflection. "A service. One that falls entirely outside the scope of your employment contract. In exchange, I am prepared to offer you $1.5 million, tax-free, deposited directly into an offshore trust in your name, which you can access immediately." Arthur froze. The silence in the room stretched until all that could be heard was the rain hitting the glass and the faint hum of the city far below. He blinked, uncomprehending. He looked around the vast office as if searching for a hidden camera. $1.5 million, he repeated, the words tasting foreign on his tongue. He let out a dry, humorless exhale. "Who do you need me to kill?" "Nobody." Claire unlaced her fingers and pointed to the chair opposite her desk. "Sit." He didn't move. "I'll stand." "Suit yourself." Claire leaned back, the leather of her wheelchair squeaking slightly. "I am 37 years old. My medical window for carrying a child is closing. The anonymous donor route is unacceptable to me. I require a known entity. Someone healthy, possessing a strong work ethic, and demonstrably capable of producing viable, resilient offspring. You fit the parameters." Arthur stared at her. His jaw slackened, then clamped shut so hard the muscle in his cheek ticked. "You're joking." "I never joke about logistics," Claire said, her tone icy. "You will provide the genetic material. My medical team will handle the IVF process. Once the pregnancy is confirmed, You will sign an airtight non-disclosure agreement and a total abdication of parental rights. You will not acknowledge the child. You will not seek visitation. You will take the money, pay off your debts, secure your daughter's future, and continue your life." Arthur let out a sound that was half laugh, half choke. He took a step back, shaking his head. He looked at her not as his billionaire boss, but as a dangerous alien species. "You're out of your mind. I am entirely rational. You want to buy my kid. I want to buy your sperm, Arthur. There is a distinct legal and biological difference. Men do it every day for $50 and a stale cookie in clinic waiting rooms. I'm offering you financial freedom. Why me?" The words burst out of him, sharp and ragged. "You have half the city in your pocket. You could have a supermodel, a genius, a guy who doesn't scrub break dust out from under his fingernails every night. Why me? I'm your mechanic, for Christ's sake." "Because you are desperate," Claire said, the brutal honesty landing between them like a physical blow. "And desperate men do not have the luxury of sudden moral epiphanies. You won't wake up in 5 years and decide you want to play father, because if you try to breach our contract, I will crush you in court. We both know this. It makes the transaction clean." Arthur's face flushed dark red beneath the grease. His hands curled into tight fists. For a second, Claire wondered if she had miscalculated, if he might actually strike her. The physical vulnerability of her seated position spiked a sudden, cold adrenaline through her chest. Instead, Arthur turned on his heel. "Keep your money," he spat over his shoulder, his voice trembling with rage. "And find another donor. I quit." He slammed his fist against the elevator call button. The doors opened immediately. He stepped in, not looking back, and vanished behind the sliding oak. Claire sat alone in the silence. Her breathing was slightly elevated. She looked down at her unresponsive legs, then back at the folder on her desk. She didn't tear it up. She didn't call security to have him escorted off the premises. She just closed the file. "He'll be back," she thought, the cynical certainty settling heavy in her chest. Pride doesn't pay the rent. The hallway of Arthur's apartment building smelled like boiling cabbage and stale cigarette smoke. It was a dense, suffocating odor that clung to his clothes before he even turned the key in his door. He pushed his way inside, dropping his keys into a chipped ceramic bowl by the entrance. The lock was sticky. He'd been meaning to fix it for weeks, but never had the energy. "Daddy!" A small, barefoot missile launched from the worn fabric sofa and collided with his knees. Arthur grunted, his anger melting instantly as he scooped Lily up. She felt terribly light. She smelled like cheap strawberry shampoo and the faint, metallic tang of the antibiotics she was still taking for her gums. "Hey, Bug," he murmured, burying his face in her messy brown hair. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the memory of Claire Montgomery's cold, assessing stare. "Did you fix the big cars today?" Lily asked, squirming back to look at him. She had a gap-toothed smile, one side slightly swollen where the dentist had dug out the infection. "Yeah, fix the big cars." He set her down gently. "Where's Mrs. Gable?" The elderly neighbor poked her head out from the tiny kitchenette, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Right here, Arthur. I heated up some leftover mac and cheese for her. You're home early. Everything all right at the garage?" "Fine," Arthur lied, his throat tight. "Just slow afternoon. Thanks for watching her, Martha." He dug his wallet out of his back pocket, pulling out 2 crumpled $20 bills. He handed them to the older woman. She hesitated, looking at the bills, then at the exhaustion carved into his face. "Keep it this week, Arthur. I know things are tight." "Take it, Martha. Please. We had an agreement." His voice was rougher than he intended, the bruised pride swelling up like a fresh blister. He shoved the money into her hand. After Martha left, the apartment felt suffocatingly small. Arthur walked into the kitchenette. The linoleum was peeling in the corners. The refrigerator hummed with a rattling, desperate sound. Taped to the freezer door was the final notice from the property management company. Next to it was the collection letter from the dental clinic. $1.5 million. The words echoed in his skull, deafening and toxic. He leaned over the small, stained sink, turning on the cold tap and splashing water onto his face. The water was lukewarm and tasted faintly of copper. He stared at his reflection in the smudged window above the sink. His eyes were bloodshot. The grease stain on his cheek was still there. He scrubbed at it violently with a rough paper towel until his skin was raw and red. But he couldn't wash off the feeling of being completely, utterly owned. Claire Montgomery wasn't a person. She was an algorithm. She had looked at him, quantified his suffering, and spit out a purchase price. Because you are desperate. He gripped the edges of the sink, his knuckles turning white. He hated her. He hated the pristine, silent penthouse. He hated the way she sat in that high-tech wheelchair, a broken woman acting like a god, moving people around like plastic pieces on a board. "Daddy?" Arthur turned. Lily was standing in the doorway, clutching a battered stuffed rabbit. She was rubbing her jaw. "Does it hurt, Bug?" he asked softly, crouching down to her level. She nodded, tears welling up in her large brown eyes. "The medicine tastes bad, and it throbs." I know, baby." He pulled her into a hug, closing his eyes as she rested her head against his shoulder. He could feel the rapid, bird-like beating of her heart. He remembered the dentist's warning last week. "The infection is deep, Mr. Pendleton. The spacer is temporary. She's going to need bone grafts in a few years to ensure the adult teeth come in properly. It's a specialized procedure. Not cheap." Arthur opened his eyes, staring blankly over his daughter's shoulder at the peeling wallpaper. He had quit his job. He had walked away from the only stable income he had, throwing a tantrum to protect his own ego, while his daughter's jaw ached in his arms. What kind of father was he? A proud one, sure. A proud, broke man who couldn't protect his kid. He squeezed Lily tighter. Claire Montgomery didn't want his soul. She didn't want a co-parent. She just wanted a biological transaction. She wanted him to bleed into a cup so she could play mother on her own twisted terms. Tax-free. Deposited directly into an offshore trust in your name. You can access it immediately. Arthur swallowed hard. The lump in his throat felt like swallowed glass. The anger in his chest was still burning, but it was being smothered, slowly and inevitably, by the cold, heavy blanket of reality. He let go of Lily, smoothing her hair back. "Go watch your cartoons, Bug. I need to make a phone call." He stood up, his knees popping in the quiet apartment. He walked over to his worn canvas jacket, slung over a kitchen chair, and pulled out his cracked cell phone. He stared at the screen for a long time. He didn't have her direct number, but he knew the garage dispatcher. His thumb hovered over the screen. His stomach roiled, a nauseating wave of self-disgust washing over him. He was selling a piece of himself. He was selling a half-sibling his daughter would never know. He was selling out to the coldest, most ruthless woman he had ever met. But as he listened to Lily hum along to the television in the other room, rubbing her swollen cheek, the choice wasn't a choice at all. Arthur hit dial. "Hey, it's Artie," he said into the phone, his voice hollow, stripped of all the fire he had shown in the penthouse. "Yeah. Can you connect me to Diane in the executive suite? Tell her the mechanic changed his mind about the suspension fix. The clinic was located on the Upper East Side, hidden behind an unmarked, frosted glass facade. Inside, it didn't smell like a hospital. It smelled like wealth. There was no sharp scent of bleach or iodine, only the faint, powdery aroma of white tea diffusers and the expensive leather of the waiting room chairs. Arthur sat at the edge of a sleek, modernist sofa that was entirely too low to the ground, his knees pointed upward, his heavy boots resting awkwardly on the pristine bamboo flooring. He felt massive, dirty, and profoundly out of place, like a stray dog locked inside a jewelry store. Across the low-glass table sat Claire. She wore a charcoal grey cashmere sweater and tailored trousers. Her wheelchair was tucked neatly into the space usually reserved for a matching armchair. She wasn't looking at him. She was scrolling through a tablet, her face illuminated by the harsh white glow of the screen. Between them sat a stack of paper 50 pages thick, the non-disclosure agreement and the termination of parental rights. "The money is in escrow," Claire said, not looking up from her screen. Her voice was devoid of any inflection, a flat line of pure business. "The moment you sign, the transfer clears. My lawyers have ensured the trust is structured to minimize your capital gains tax. You should have full liquidity by tomorrow morning." Arthur stared at the paper. Next to it was a heavy, silver Mont Blanc pen. He hadn't slept in 3 days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lily's swollen jaw, followed immediately by the cold, calculating eyes of the woman sitting across from him. He had spent his whole life working with his hands, trading his physical labor for an hourly wage. This was different. He was selling his biology. He was selling a ghost. He leaned forward. The leather of the sofa squeaked beneath his weight. He picked up the pen. It was heavy, cold metal against his calloused skin. "If she ever needs bone marrow," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp, "or a kidney, or a blood transfusion." Claire finally looked up. Her expression was perfectly smooth, utterly guarded. "I am securing $1.5 million for your silence and your absence, Arthur. Not your organs. I have the resources to procure whatever medical necessities arise. You are a donor, not a contingency plan." "It's a biological fact, Ms. Montgomery," he fired back, the pen digging into the pad of his thumb. "If this kid gets sick and needs a genetic match, you can't just buy that from a catalogue. You'd have to come back to me." "What then? Does the NDA cover me saving a kid's life?" A muscle in Claire's jaw feathered. For a fraction of a second, the titanium armor of her composure cracked, revealing a flash of deep, primal irritation. She hated variables she couldn't control. She hated that he had identified a flaw in her perfect, sterile system. "Sign the paperwork, Mr. Pendleton." Arthur looked down at the signature line. It blurred slightly at the edges. He swallowed the bile rising in his throat, pressed the silver nib to the thick cotton paper, and signed his name. He didn't read the clauses. He knew what they said. "You are nothing. You are a transaction." A male nurse in crisp, dark blue scrubs appeared at the edge of the waiting area. "Mr. Pendleton, we're ready for you in room 4. Arthur stood up. He didn't look at Claire again. He followed the nurse down a long, white corridor. The room he was led into was windowless, equipped with a leather recliner, a sink, and a flat-screen television. A sterile plastic cup with a barcode sat on a stainless steel tray. "Take your time," the nurse said, his tone professionally neutral. "Press the button on the wall when you're finished." The door clicked shut. The lock engaged with a heavy, metallic thud. Arthur stood in the center of the room. The silence was absolute. He stared at the empty plastic cup. A wave of profound, suffocating shame washed over him, hot and prickly against his scalp. He gripped the edge of the stainless steel tray until his knuckles popped, squeezing his eyes shut. "It's for Lily," he told himself. The mantra felt hollow, repeating over and over in his skull like a broken gear. It's just biology. It's just a job. 20 minutes later, he walked out of the clinic and into the biting November wind. His phone buzzed in his pocket. A text message from a Cayman Islands banking proxy. Incoming transfer, $1,500,000 US. Status, cleared. Arthur stopped on the crowded sidewalk, pedestrians brushing past his shoulders. He stared at the string of zeros on the cracked screen. He was rich. He was entirely debt-free. He turned into a narrow alleyway between a deli and a dry cleaner, bent over a trash can, and threw up. 5 months later, the smell of ozone in Claire's penthouse had been replaced by the sharp, medicinal scent of peppermint oil. She sat at her desk, her knuckles white as she gripped the armrests of her chair. A wave of nausea rolled violently through her stomach, followed by a deep, grinding ache in her lower lumbar region. The doctors had warned her. They had told her that the altered center of gravity would put catastrophic pressure on her fused vertebrae. They had told her the limited mobility in her abdominal muscles would make carrying a child agonizing. They had been right. Claire closed her eyes, forcing her breathing into a slow, measured 4-count rhythm. In, 2, 3, 4. Hold. She hated this. She hated the parasite in her uterus, hijacking her carefully managed biology. Her legs, which had been blissfully numb and silent for a decade, had started experiencing aggressive, agonizing muscle spasms, ghost pains triggered by the pressure on her compromised spinal cord. But she was pregnant. It was a girl. The viability scans were flawless. The asset was secured. The intercom on her desk clicked. "Ms. Montgomery." Claire opened her eyes, wiping a bead of cold sweat from her upper lip. "What is it, Diane?" "I have the Q3 logistical reports for the East Coast trucking fleet. And Arthur Pendleton is downstairs in the private garage. He needs your authorization signature for the modifications to the new SUV." Claire's stomach clenched. And this time it wasn't the pregnancy. Arthur. She hadn't fired him. Terminating his employment immediately after the clinic would have created a paper trail of retaliation, a loose thread a clever lawyer could pull if things ever went south. Instead, she had kept him exactly where he was, assuming his new wealth would prompt his resignation. It hadn't. Arthur had paid off his debts. He had moved out of the slums and into a decent townhouse in Queens. He had fixed his daughter's teeth. But every Monday at 6 a.m., he clocked in at the subterranean garage, put on his dark blue coveralls, and went to work on her cars. It infuriated her. It was a blatant refusal to play by the rules she had established. He was supposed to take the money and disappear into the ether. Instead, he lingered in the basement of her building like a stubborn stain. "Send him up," Claire snapped. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors slid open. Arthur stepped out. He looked different. The exhaustion that used to weigh down his shoulders was gone. His skin looked healthier. The dark circles under his eyes faded. But he still wore the same coveralls, and he still smelled like grease and burnt rubber. He held a clipboard. He stopped short when he saw her. Claire had cancelled all in-person meetings for the last month. She was showing. Beneath the tailored silk of her blouse, her stomach was undeniably rounded. Arthur's eyes darted to her midsection. The reaction was instantaneous. His breath hitched, a tiny, barely audible intake of air, and his jaw locked tightly. He quickly dragged his gaze back up to her face. "I need your signature," he said, his voice tight, "for the reinforced suspension on the Escalade, to accommodate the added weight of the new ramp system." He walked forward and placed the clipboard on her desk. He didn't slide it toward her. He placed it carefully, ensuring their hands wouldn't accidentally brush. Claire looked at the clipboard, then at him. "You're still here. I work here. You have $1.5 million in liquid capital, Mr. Pendleton. Men with that kind of money do not change oil filters." "I like the work," Arthur said flatly. "Keeps my hands busy. It's an act of defiance." Claire picked up her pen, gripping it hard enough to make her knuckles ache. You want to prove that my money didn't change you. It's a pathetic, working-class vanity. Call it whatever you want, Ms. Montgomery. Arthur crossed his arms. Sign the paper so I can get back to my job. Claire glared at him, lowering the pen to the paper. As she leaned forward, a violent spasm tore through her lower back. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a blinding, white-hot knife driving straight into the crushed remnants of her L4 vertebrae. Claire gasped, a sharp, ragged sound, and dropped the pen. It clattered across the marble desk. Her left hand flew to her stomach, her right gripping the wheel of her chair as her torso pitched forward, entirely out of her control. "Hey!" Arthur moved before he even thought about it. He lunged around the desk, his heavy boots thudding against the Persian rug. He caught her by the shoulders just as she slumped forward, preventing her from hitting her head on the edge of the marble desk. "Don't touch me!" Claire hissed through gritted teeth. "You're falling, damn it," Arthur growled, his grip firm. He didn't let go. He pushed her gently but forcefully back into the upright position, against the backrest of her chair. She was trembling. The cold sweat had broken out across her forehead again. Up close, Arthur could see the dark, bruised exhaustion beneath her immaculate makeup. She smelled like mint and copper. "Let go of me," she ordered, her voice shaking with pain and fury. Arthur slowly removed his hands from her shoulders, stepping back, holding his palms up in a gesture of surrender. "All right, I'm off. You need a doctor? I need you to leave my office." Arthur stared down at her. He saw the way she clutched her stomach. His child was in there. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, a sudden, heavy pressure in his chest that made it hard to breathe. He had signed away his rights, but his biology was currently breaking her body apart. "You're in pain," he said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its defensive edge. "It is a calculated biological tax. It is managed." Claire adjusted her blouse, her hands shaking slightly. She picked up the pen with immense effort and scratched her signature onto his clipboard. She shoved it toward him. "Take it and get out." Arthur picked up the clipboard. He looked at her for a long, heavy moment. He saw the terror hiding just behind the rigid, furious mask of the billionaire CEO. She was trapped in a body that was failing her, carrying a child she had bought from a man who was currently watching her break. "It's not just a transaction anymore, is it?" Arthur said quietly. Claire's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "You signed a contract. You are nothing to this child. You are a ghost. Do not overstep, Mr. Pendleton." "I don't want your kid," Arthur lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "But you're too damn proud to admit when you're drowning. If you fall out of that chair when nobody's around, the contract won't save you." He turned and walked toward the elevator. Claire watched him go, her breathing ragged, her spine screaming in agony. She hated him. She hated him because he was right. Month 8 arrived with the subtlety of a car crash. The penthouse had been transformed. The sleek, minimalist aesthetic was now compromised by the intrusion of medical machinery. A fetal heart monitor sat on a glass side table. An IV stand stood rigidly next to Claire's bed, holding a bag of saline and magnesium to control her spiking blood pressure. She was on strict, mandatory bed rest. Her body had effectively gone on strike. The weight of the baby had compressed the nerves in her spine to a critical degree, triggering autonomic dysreflexia. Her blood pressure spiked dangerously high, threatening a stroke, while her legs, utterly useless to her, violently spasmed for hours at a time. Claire lay in the center of her massive, king-sized bed. The room was dark, the heavy blackout curtains drawn against the glaring afternoon sun. She felt entirely stripped of her power. She couldn't work. She couldn't sit up without triggering a blinding headache. She was a hostage in her own fortress. The heavy mahogany door to her bedroom cracked open. "Diane, I told you I don't want the quarterly projections until tomorrow," Claire snapped, her voice weak but laced with venom. "It's not Diane." Claire froze. She turned her head, fighting the stiffness in her neck. Arthur stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing his coveralls. He wore a faded flannel shirt and dark jeans. He held a small, heavy-looking canvas tool bag in his right hand. "How did you get in here?" Claire demanded, her heart rate immediately spiking. The monitor next to her bed began to beep with a faster, higher pitch. "Security let me up. Diane told them to." Arthur stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. "Your customized infant car seat arrived. The mechanics on the locking mechanism are completely jammed. Diane said you refused to let the manufacturer send a tech up because you didn't want strangers in the penthouse seeing you like this. So she sent you." Claire closed her eyes, a wave of profound humiliation washing over her. "Get out." "No." Claire opened her eyes, shocked by the flat, immovable refusal. "Excuse me?" "I said no." Arthur walked over to the corner of the room, where the massive high-tech bassinet and the jammed car seat sat in their plastic wrapping. He dropped his tool bag onto the floor. "You can fire me tomorrow. You can sue me. But right now, you have a broken locking mechanism on a seat meant for a newborn, and you're too damn paranoid to let anyone fix it. So I'm fixing it." He unzipped the canvas bag and pulled out a set of Allen wrenches and a flashlight. He knelt beside the car seat and went to work, turning his back on her. Claire watched him, her chest heaving. She reached for the call button to summon building security, but her fingers stopped an inch from the plastic device. The room was silent, except for the metallic clinking of Arthur's tools and the steady, rhythmic beeping of her heart monitor. "You shouldn't be here," Claire whispered. The fight had suddenly drained out of her, leaving only a hollow, terrifying exhaustion. "Probably not," Arthur agreed, not looking up. He shined the flashlight into the locking joint of the heavy plastic base. "But Diane was crying in the hallway. She said you haven't eaten in 2 days. She said you're terrifying the nursing staff so badly they wait in the kitchen until you ring the bell." "They hover," Claire muttered defensively. "I despise hovering." Arthur let out a short, rough laugh. "Yeah, you like being in control. Hard to be in control when you're stuck flat on your back. You have no idea what it's like," she hissed, the vulnerability twisting into anger. "To have your body refuse your commands, to be trapped inside a failing piece of machinery." Arthur stopped turning his wrench. He sat back on his heels and looked at her over his shoulder. The room was dim, but she could see the raw, unvarnished intensity in his eyes. "No, I don't know what it's like to be paralyzed," Arthur said quietly. "But I know what it's like to be trapped. I know what it's like to lie awake at night, completely powerless, watching everything you care about hang by a thread while you can't do a damn thing to fix it. I lived like that for 6 years, Claire." It was the first time he had ever used her first name. It hung in the air between them, heavier than the medical equipment. He turned back to the car seat. "There's a stripped gear in the release latch. Factory defect. I can bypass it, but it's going to take me about 20 minutes. Claire stared at the ceiling. A slow, agonizing spasm gripped her right leg. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, refusing to make a sound, refusing to let him see her cry out. But Arthur heard the rustle of the heavy duvet. He heard the sharp, sudden intake of her breath. He dropped his tools. He walked over to the side of the bed. "Don't!" Claire choked out, tears of pure, blinding pain prickling at the corners of her eyes. "Look away." "Shut up," Arthur said, his voice surprisingly gentle. He reached under the heavy blanket, finding her right leg. His large, calloused hands gripped the rigid, spasming muscle of her calf. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't treat her like glass. He applied a deep, brutal, steady pressure. the exact kind of counterforce her physical therapists used, but with the raw strength of a mechanic used to unbending steel. Claire gasped, her head falling back into the pillows as the agony began to slowly, incrementally recede under his grip. "Breathe," Arthur ordered softly, his hands moving up to massage the knotted tension near her knee. Just breathe. She hated him for seeing this. She hated him for knowing exactly how to fix the broken parts of her world. But as the spasm melted away, leaving her breathless and shivering in the dark, she didn't tell him to take his hands away. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I bought you. I humiliated you." Arthur kept his eyes on her leg, his thumbs working in slow, rhythmic circles. "Because you're carrying my kid," he said, the truth finally tearing through the ironclad NDA, through the millions of dollars, through the sterile, cynical reality she had built. And because nobody should have to go through a systems failure alone. Water pooled on the imported Brazilian hardwood floor, soaking into the fibers of the hand-tufted rug. Claire stared at it, her mind blanking out the protocols she had meticulously drafted for this exact scenario. It wasn't a small leak. It was a sudden, violent flood that smelled distinctly of saline and raw biology. Panic, cold and sharp, drove a spike into her chest. She couldn't feel the fluid running down her paralyzed legs, but she could see the dark stain spreading across her silk lounge pants. Her uterus contracted. The monitor next to her bed shrieked an alarm as her blood pressure skyrocketed, the autonomic dysreflexia kicking in instantly. Her body was interpreting the labor not as a natural process, but as a catastrophic trauma. "Diane!" Claire screamed, the sound tearing her throat. The next 40 minutes were a blur of flashing ambulance lights, the harsh jolts of the stretcher against the uneven pavement, and the metallic, coppery taste of fear flooding her mouth. The hospital smelt like industrial bleach and rubbing alcohol. Fluorescent lights passed overhead in a strobing, nauseating rhythm as orderlies rushed her down the stark white corridors. Her obstetrician, Dr. Eris Thorne, no, strike that, Dr. Eris Miller, was waiting in the surgical bay. "Her blood pressure is 220 over 110. We need her in the OR for a cesarean immediately, or she's going to stroke out," Miller barked, his voice muffled by a blue surgical mask. "Claire, can you hear me? We're putting you under general. Your spine won't tolerate a block." Claire grabbed the metal railing of the gurney. Her knuckles were bone white. She couldn't breathe. The spasms in her legs were so violent they threatened to throw her off the narrow bed, requiring 2 nurses to hold her down. She was losing control. The pristine walls of her empire were collapsing, leaving her exposed, broken, and terrified. "No," Claire gasped, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. "No, General. I need to be awake. I have to see her." "You're going to have a seizure, Miss Montgomery. We don't have time to negotiate." "Wait!" she choked out, her fingers digging into the sterile paper sheet beneath her. Her brain scrambled for an anchor. Her systems were failing. She needed someone who understood failing systems. "Call him. Diane! Diane!" Her assistant materialized at the edge of her vision, her face pale, holding a tablet like a shield. "I'm here, Claire. I'm right here." "Call the mechanic," Claire ordered, her voice dropping into a ragged, desperate whisper. "Get Arthur." "Mom, he's not—" "Get him." The anesthesia mask descended over her nose and mouth. The air tasted sweet, chemical, and heavy. The edges of the room went black. When Claire blinked her eyes open, she was no longer in the harsh glare of the operating room. She was in a dimly lit recovery suite. The rhythmic, mechanical sigh of a ventilator hissed in the corner. Her mouth felt like dry cotton. A dull, throbbing ache radiated from her abdomen, suppressed by a heavy blanket of narcotics. She turned her head to the right. Arthur was sitting in a vinyl hospital chair. He looked entirely out of place, amidst the sterile medical equipment. He was wearing a faded denim jacket, his hands clasped between his knees. His knuckles were bruised, the skin around his fingernails permanently stained with oil. He was staring at the floor. "You smell like exhaust," Claire rasped. Her voice sounded like crushed gravel. Arthur's head snapped up. He stood, his large frame blocking the light from the hallway window. He moved to the edge of her bed, his expression unreadable. He looked exhausted. "You're awake," he said quietly. "Diane called me. Said you were screaming for a mechanic. Figured you didn't mean the elevator repair guy." "Where is she?" Claire demanded, attempting to sit up. Fire ripped across her lower abdomen, slicing through the painkillers. She gasped, falling back against the pillows. "Hey, don't move," Arthur ordered, his hand instinctively reaching out to hover over her shoulder before he pulled it back, remembering the invisible boundary line between them. "She's in the NICU. They had to take her a month early. Her lungs need a little help, but the doctors say she's stable, she's loud, has a pair of lungs on her." Claire stared at the ceiling tiles. They were textured, dotted with tiny, irregular holes. She traced them with her eyes, trying to process the information. The baby was alive. The asset was secure, but the relief she expected didn't come. Instead, a hollow, terrifying void opened up in her chest. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. "The clause states your involvement ends upon the child's extraction. The contract is fulfilled. You have your money." Arthur let out a harsh, bitter exhale. He reached into the inside pocket of his denim jacket and pulled out a folded piece of thick cotton paper. He tossed it onto the bed. It landed on her chest with a soft thud. Claire recognized the blue ink of her own signature. The NDA. The abdication of parental rights. "I sat in the waiting room for 4 hours while they sliced you open," Arthur said, his voice low, vibrating with a suppressed, raw emotion. "I watched them wheel out a plastic box with a 3-pound kid inside. My kid. She has my jawline, Claire. She's got my dark hair. And I realized something while I was sitting there, drinking burnt hospital coffee." He leaned closer, resting his hands on the metal guardrail of her bed. He smelled intensely of cold outside air, old leather, and a deep, masculine sweat. "I realized that I don't give a damn about your contract." Claire's heart rate spiked, the monitor by her head beeping in rapid succession. "You signed it. You took the money. You tried to take her from me, and I will ruin you, Arthur. I will bury you in litigation until you can't afford to feed Lily." "I don't want to take her from you," Arthur fired back, his eyes dark and furious. "I'm not trying to steal your kid, but I'm not walking away either. You almost died today because you're too damn stubborn to admit your body can't handle this on its own. You're going to take this baby back to a penthouse, hand her off to a rotation of night nurses, and manage her like a stock portfolio. That is none of your concern." "It is my concern," Arthur shouted, his voice cracking like a whip through the quiet room. He caught himself, taking a ragged breath, lowering his volume but not his intensity. "She's blood. I sold her to you because I thought I had no choice, because I was desperate. But I'm not desperate anymore. I paid my debts, and I'm telling you right now, you need help. Not an employee, not a nurse. Someone who actually gives a damn." Claire closed her eyes. A tear, hot and humiliating, leaked from the corner of her eye and slid into her hair. She hated her weakness. She hated that she couldn't move her legs. She hated that he had seen her completely unraveled. And most of all, she hated that his presence made the terror in her chest recede. "Get out," she whispered, turning her face away from him. "Leave me alone." Arthur stared at her for a long time. The anger drained out of his posture, leaving only a heavy, sad resignation. "All right, Claire," he said softly. I'll go. He turned and walked toward the door. The heavy rubber soles of his boots squeaked slightly on the linoleum. He didn't look back. The door clicked shut. The room was utterly silent, save for the mechanical hiss of the ventilator. Claire lay in the dark, her hands clutching the torn contract resting on her chest. She had won. She had driven him away. Her system was intact. She had never felt so entirely, paralyzingly alone. 3 weeks later, the penthouse smelled of sour milk, expensive baby powder, and exhaustion. Claire sat in her custom titanium wheelchair in the center of the living room. Rain lashed against the floor-to-ceiling windows, mirroring the exact weather of the day she had first summoned Arthur upstairs. But everything else was different. The marble coffee table was covered in sterile bottles, breast pump components, and crumpled burp cloths. The pristine silence of her home had been permanently shattered by the piercing, relentless wailing of a newborn. Morgan. She had named her Morgan. A night nurse in a crisp white uniform stood nervously near the kitchen island, holding the red-faced, screaming infant. "Give her to me," Claire commanded, her voice thin and ragged. Dark circles hung under her eyes like bruised plums. She hadn't slept more than 2 consecutive hours in 21 days. The incision on her abdomen still burned with every micro-movement. "Ms. Montgomery, you need rest. Your blood pressure is elevating again. Please let me soothe her," the nurse pleaded. I said, "Give her to me." The nurse approached cautiously and lowered the screaming bundle into Claire's arms. Morgan was tiny, fragile, and utterly inconsolable. Her little fists were balled up tightly, her face a mask of primal fury. Claire looked down at the child she had bought, paid for, and bled to bring into the world. She felt a profound, crushing wave of inadequacy. She couldn't walk her daughter around the room to bounce her to sleep. She couldn't easily lean over to pick her up from the floor. Her compromised core muscles made simply holding the baby for extended periods a physical agony. "Shh," Claire whispered, rocking her upper body back and forth awkwardly. "Quiet now, please. Morgan, stop." The baby screamed louder. The sound drilled directly into Claire's prefrontal cortex. She felt a hot, dangerous panic rising in her throat. She was failing. The logistics were breaking down. She had millions in the bank, teams of lawyers, and a global fleet of vehicles. But she couldn't stop a 7-pound infant from crying. She pressed the intercom button on her wheelchair. "Diane." "Yes, Claire?" The assistant's voice sounded just as exhausted. "Fire the nanny agency. Send this one home. Find a new firm, one that understands basic pediatric soothing protocols." "Claire, this is the 3rd nurse this week. The baby has colic. It's biological, not a breach of protocol. You can't fire biology." "Watch me!" Claire snapped, releasing the button. She looked down at Morgan. The baby's eyes were squeezed shut, her mouth wide open. Claire felt a tear slide down her own cheek, dropping onto the soft cotton of Morgan's onesie. "I don't know what to do," Claire confessed to the empty room, the absolute truth finally breaking through her titanium shell. "I don't know how to fix this." Across the city, in a brightly lit townhouse in Queens, Arthur was standing in his new, spacious kitchen. He was cooking pancakes. The smell of burning butter and maple syrup filled the air. Lily was sitting at the granite counter, swinging her legs. Her teeth were perfectly straight now, the spaces removed, her smile bright and unburdened. She was drawing on a piece of construction paper with a purple crayon. "Daddy, you burned the edges again," Lily observed, pointing her crayon at the pan. "They're extra crispy, Bug. It's a culinary technique," Arthur lied, scraping the blackened pancake onto a plate. He moved through his new life like a ghost, haunting his own house. The bank account was full. He didn't have to clock in at the subterranean garage ever again. He had quit formally 2 weeks ago. He spent his days taking Lily to the park, fixing up the house, and staring at the wall. He was safe. He had secured his daughter's future, but his hands felt empty. He missed the smell of motor oil. He missed the satisfying weight of a wrench. And, like a phantom limb, he felt the persistent, agonizing tug of a biological tether stretching across the city, anchoring him to a penthouse he was legally barred from entering. He couldn't stop thinking about the tiny, dark-haired infant in the plastic hospital box. He couldn't stop thinking about Claire's face, pale and terrified, as she lay in the recovery room. His phone buzzed on the counter. He wiped his hands on a dish towel and picked it up. It was an unknown number. He swiped to answer. "Hello?" "Arthur." The voice was brittle, barely more than a whisper. Arthur's grip on the phone tightened instantly. He recognized the tone. It was the sound of a system in critical failure. "Claire? What's wrong? Is it the baby?" "Her name is Morgan." Claire breathed into the receiver. In the background, Arthur could hear the high-pitched, jagged screaming of the infant. And I can't do it." "Can't do what?" "Fix it," Claire choked out. It was a sound of total surrender. "The nurses don't work. The routines don't work. I can't stand up to bounce her. My back is failing. I'm failing." Arthur closed his eyes. The torn contract he had thrown on her hospital bed flashed in his mind. "You try to take her from me, and I will ruin you." She had drawn the lines. She had built the walls. But he was a mechanic. His entire life was built on fixing broken things. He looked over at Lily, who was happily chewing on a piece of burnt pancake. "Martha still living down the street?" Arthur asked his daughter. Lily nodded, her mouth full. "Yeah. She gave me a hard candy yesterday." Arthur put the phone back to his ear. "I'm coming over. Tell security to let me up the private elevator." He didn't wait for her to answer. He hung up. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime. Arthur stepped out. He didn't bother wiping his boots. He walked down the hallway, following the sound of the crying. He entered the living room and stopped dead. The immaculate CEO, the woman who had quantified his desperation and bought his DNA, was sitting in her wheelchair, looking like a survivor of a shipwreck. Her hair was tangled. Her designer clothes were stained with spit-up. She looked entirely, beautifully human. Claire looked up as he entered. She didn't glare. She didn't order him out. She simply held out her arms, offering him the screaming baby. Arthur crossed the room in 3 long strides. He reached down and scooped Morgan up. He didn't cradle her gently like glass. He tucked her firmly against his chest, supporting her head with his massive hand, pressing her stomach against his shoulder. He began to pace the length of the living room, his heavy boots creating a deep, rhythmic vibration on the hardwood floor. He hummed a low, vibrating baritone note deep in his chest. It was the same vibration he used to calm Lily when she had nightmares. For 30 seconds, Morgan fought him, her screams reaching a fever pitch. But the firm pressure on her stomach, combined with the deep, rumbling vibration of his chest and the rhythmic thud of his boots, began to override her nervous system. The screams fractured into ragged hiccups. Then, a soft whimper. Within 2 minutes, the penthouse was completely, miraculously silent. Morgan was asleep, her tiny face buried in the collar of Arthur's flannel shirt. Arthur stopped pacing. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out at the rain-slicked city. The smell of newborn skin and warm milk hit his nose, a sensory overload that made his chest ache fiercely. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply, allowing himself to feel the terrible, beautiful weight of the child. Claire watched him. She sat frozen in her chair, her hands empty in her lap. The silence in the room wasn't the sterile, lonely silence she was used to. It felt heavy. It felt inhabited. "How did you do that?" she whispered, staring at his broad back. Arthur turned around slowly, careful not to jostle the sleeping infant. He walked back to the center of the room and looked down at Claire. "She has gas," Arthur said softly. "The colic is just trapped air. She needed pressure on her stomach and a steady rhythm to distract her. The nurses were treating her like a porcelain doll. She's not fragile, Claire. She's just frustrated." Claire looked at the sleeping baby, then up at Arthur's face. He looked entirely at peace, holding the child he had signed away. "I tore up my copy of the contract," Claire said. The words tasted like ash and copper, but she forced them out. It was an admission of defeat. "I had my lawyers draft a revocation of the NDA. You're legally free. You don't have to hide." Arthur's jaw tightened. "I didn't come here for legal clearance." "Then why did you come?" she asked, her voice cracking, the raw desperation leaking through. "You have your money. You have your daughter. Why did you answer the phone?" Arthur shifted Morgan's weight slightly. He looked around the massive, cold penthouse, then back down to the woman in the chair. He saw past the titanium and the billions of dollars. He saw a woman who was terrified of her own vulnerability. "Because you asked for help," Arthur said simply. "You finally admitted you can't engineer everything. You can't buy your way out of being human." "I am a liability to her," Claire whispered, her gaze dropping to her paralyzed legs. "I can't even carry her across the room without risking a spinal spasm. I thought if I controlled the variables, if I bought the best genetics, the best equipment, I could bypass my own limitations." "You don't bypass them," Arthur countered, his voice steady and grounded. "You work with them. You find the leverage points. When a suspension is blown, you don't throw away the car. You rebuild the framework." He walked closer to her chair. He knelt down, the joints in his knees popping. He was now eye level with her, holding their sleeping daughter between them. "I'm not a donor," Arthur said, his eyes locking onto hers. The gravel in his voice was gone, replaced by a deep, immovable certainty. "I'm her father. And I'm Lily's father. I'm a package deal. I don't want your money, Claire. I already have it, and it makes me miserable. I want my hands on the wheel." Claire's breath caught. She looked at his rough, oil-stained fingers cradling the fragile head of their child. She looked at the raw, unpolished honesty in his face. It was entirely unpredictable. It was deeply inefficient. It was a massive, terrifying liability. "You're demanding co-parenting rights," she stated, slipping back into corporate terminology as a defense mechanism. Arthur let out a low, tired laugh. "I'm demanding you stop treating this family like a hostile takeover. I'm demanding a place at the table, not as an employee, not as a ghost. I'm here. If you want me to walk out that door, tell me right now, and I'll never come back. I'll leave her here, and I'll walk away. But if I stay for real. Messy, unpredictable, all of it." Claire stared at him. The penthouse was utterly quiet, save for the soft, rhythmic breathing of the baby. For the first time in 11 years, since the accident that broke her spine, she didn't try to calculate the odds. She didn't look for an exit strategy. She looked at Arthur, really looked at him, and realized that for the first time in her life, she felt safe. She reached out. Her hand trembled slightly. She didn't touch the baby. She bypassed the child entirely and placed her manicured fingers over Arthur's calloused, rough knuckles. His skin was warm. It felt like reality. "Stay," Claire whispered, the word hanging in the air like a final, binding contract. "Please." Arthur didn't smile. He didn't offer a platitude. He simply turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers, his grip tight, grounding her to the earth. "Okay," he said. It wasn't a fairy tale. The logistics were going to be a nightmare. The blending of a billionaire CEO and a grease-stained mechanic with a 6-year-old daughter was a statistical anomaly doomed to friction. But as they sat together in the quiet penthouse, the rain beating against the glass, the systems were finally, imperfectly, aligned. Claire tried to purchase predictability, but Arthur brought humanity back into her sterile world. Their journey proves that while money can build fortresses, it takes raw, imperfect vulnerability to build a family. They have a long, messy road ahead, blending entirely different lives, but the foundation is finally real. What did you think of Claire and Arthur's intense collision of worlds? Did Arthur make the right choice, staying? Let me know your thoughts down below. If this grounded, emotional story hooked you, please hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human audio dramas.